Okay, so this week is going to be training and development, this module. Training and development is really something I can try to teach you as much as I can here, much like everything else, like job analysis. But once again, training and development is really something that you learn by doing. So I will do my best here to try and teach you as much as I can about training and development and how we can engage in best practices. But if ever you're interested in IO psychology, this is where, as one of my practitioner friends said, is where the big bucks are. So this might be something that you end up doing a lot of if you pursue a position in IO psychology. So a question to contemplate before you move on to the next slide is, how do you think training and development fits into everything that we have been doing in this class? Where do you think training and development fits into all of the concepts that we have been discussing? So sit there and think about that and answer it to yourself. Okay, so here's how training and development fits into the things we've been talking about thus far. So, like I said, job analysis for the most part is the overarching thing that either impacts or encapsulates or influences most, if not all, of what we've talked about. Training and development, as you can see right here highlighted, is an outcome of sometimes performance assessment, namely that by virtue of performance assessment, you understand what your employees are lacking on and what needs to be improved upon. But training and development can also be influenced by job analysis. So if you know that you need your employees who you currently have to be engaging in certain tasks, or you decide we have done a job analysis, but we're doing more of a strategic job analysis, that may influence your training and development. Usually you can't really assess training and development needs without doing a performance assessment. So these two things are inextricably linked together, but that's where training and development would appear in our system listed up here. So a quick reminder that not everything in the textbook is here. I don't cover things like instructional design, and not every definition is provided again because I don't want to reiterate everything that's in your book because you all can read it. So that doesn't mean that these things won't be on the quiz, but just wanted you all to know and be aware of that. So what is training? Training is refers to formalized procedures used by organizations or a company to encourage learning for employees. Usually it's for the purpose of organizational goals, objectives. We'll talk about how that trickles down in a moment. Or it can be based on current or anticipated needs. So the organization realizes that it wants to be somewhere in the future, and so it starts to train employees to reach that anticipated need. So what is then learning? Because the goal of training is to have employees learn. Learning is the acquisition of knowledge or skill or ability even. It results in a change in behavior through experience, observation, and or practice. You can't just learn by osmosis. So you can't just learn by reading about something per se. You can, in the sense that you can't just read about something and then hope that you'll remember it. Human memory, human retrieval of information, the integration of information in our minds so that we can draw upon the knowledge in the future is very complex. It takes practice, and practice can manifest in a number of different ways. For example, in this class, your quizzes are essentially a form of practice. The activities that we do are a form of practice because the idea is you have to test your knowledge. You have to engage with the knowledge. You have to engage with facts and your understanding in order for your brain to solidify the connections between concepts and make your ease of retrieval easier in the future. So the whole point of training and development as it relates to learning is that you have to not only provide the mechanisms by which employees can acquire knowledge, but that they can also retain and apply that knowledge. Okay. How to assess your needs. So as I said earlier, just to skip back a bit, an organization can decide that it needs to do training based on current or anticipated needs. Now, how do organizations identify and assess the needs that they have? Well, there are 4 different ways we can go about doing this: organizational analysis, task analysis, person analysis, and demographic analysis. Organizational analysis looks at what does the organization want to do and where are they now. So for example, if your organization wants to start becoming more involved in innovation and creativity and the fields that rely on innovation and creativity, then they may say, okay, we need to do an assessment of where our employees stand on their ability to leverage creativity. So that's one way we would do organizational analysis. The organization itself, the company's needs and goals determine what you want to achieve by virtue of training. Task analysis, on the other hand, relates to what tasks need to be done better. Let's say you work at UPS and you notice that people are complaining about mail being thrown onto porches, that you're getting a lot of companies reporting that they're going to rescind their contracts or take you to court for violation of contracts because a lot of their goods are arriving damaged to customers. So maybe we decide, if we are at UPS, that, okay, we need to retrain people on this task of how to properly deliver a piece of mail. So that might be one way that we do a task-based analysis. A person analysis, on the other hand, it is related to all of the above because we have to decide who needs training on what and why. But we can also have people do tests after entry or nominate themselves because they decide that they need to be trained in a certain way, even if the organization has not identified them as needing training. Or even sometimes certain events prompt us to realize that our employees need training because otherwise we don't have the systems to identify them. If you are familiar with The Office or have started watching it, you can see that Michael Scott, the boss of the regional manager of the branch that we see, he often engages in behaviors that prompt trainings. He engages in sexual harassment. He outs an employee. He engages in racially insensitive comments, and it prompts the need for training because he's not demonstrating the skills and the abilities that we would expect a manager to. So that's person-based analysis. Demographic analysis is related to person analysis, and this gets at who may need training based on their demographics. So age, gender, ethnicity, race. We wouldn't make a judgment that someone needs training based on race because that could get you into legal hot water. But we may say, in order to make sure that our employees are not effectively aging out of the workforce due to lack of skills, we want to make sure that our older employees are trained on technology changes. And so in that way, we may do a demographic analysis to make sure that our people of a certain age or even young people need to be leveled up on certain knowledge, skills, and abilities. So learning at work, let's talk about it. How does it happen and what encourages it? So how does learning take place and what can we do? What can we do to facilitate learning in our organizations? So first, it's really critical if you want learning to take place for your organization to be one that values learning, one that is a culture and a climate that encourages learning. So there are certain a lot of organizations will probably pay lip service to this, right? That we're constantly developing and encouraging our employees to do, continuing education programs. But there's a distinction between what is stated and what is actually integrated into the culture. And some cultures are just better at doing this. And by cultures, I mean organizational cultures are better at doing this than others. So everywhere values learning, everywhere wants its employees to get better, but some are just better about emphasizing it. So a learning organization is one that has a culture that emphasizes learning by developing and acquiring knowledge and becoming better. There are some organizations that just do not care about their employees getting better. They just want to make sure that we're meeting the goals and metrics that we need to. No need to fret about being better at what we do. There's also the idea of continuous learning, so the process of learning. So organizations that encourage continuous learning are those that are interested in continually encouraging their employees um, to learn. That every opportunity, every failure is an opportunity for learning. Um, and organizations that do this can encourage their employees to learn by reflecting on their experience, um, seeking feedback, and using that as an opportunity to improve. Elon Musk is known to have a pretty interesting idea. Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, has a really interesting idea about failure, and he says that failure is really important to innovation. And I think he's known to say a lot of things like failure is an option at Tesla. And you have companies that say failure is not an option. Without failure, without trial and error, you can't learn. And in a culture where they say failure is not an option, that actually doesn't encourage a lot of learning. It actually encourages people to just try to achieve performance goals rather than trying to look at everything as, yes, an opportunity to do well, but also an opportunity to learn. So this is where we can get organizations that vary on this. And let's talk then about those principles of learning that can lead us to be better learners in our organizations and be better learners via training and development. So these are active learning. We're going to talk about active learning, the size of the unit of what we're learning, the meaningfulness of what we're learning, how we can practice and overlearn, and the principles behind getting feedback. So active learning, how do we partake in active learning? Well, we must provide learners with an activity that requires engagement. So we will talk about this in a second, but lectures really aren't active. And I say that well aware that I am giving you a lecture right now. That is why I complement lectures with the activities in class and the quizzes and the assignments and extra credit. Because active learning requires engagement. It requires something of some aspect of doing. And so when you want to allow your employees to engage in active learning, you must provide them with an activity that requires that integration and application of whatever they have been trying to learn. So they must apply and utilize the knowledge or skill they're being taught in training. So some examples of how we can encourage active learning: problem solving. That's one thing that I do in our activities is I give you all problems to solve. Practice. Quizzes can be a form of practice. You're practicing what you have been taught, usually for the purpose of applying it later. Interactions with other people, so just having conversations. Last week we had a discussion in which I posed some questions and I asked you all to reflect on concepts and give your thoughts and opinions. That's another way in which we can engage in active learning. So these are some of the ways that we can make sure that the learning basically sticks with us. You can't learn well by just reading a book and hoping it sits there. That's why making flashcards, though pretty basic, is a pretty good, well, it's basic, but it can make sure that you're actually practicing and learning the material. Of course, it's just rote memorization and not actual application. Once again, this shows that if you pick up the textbook and you read a chapter and I were to quiz you right after it, you probably wouldn't retain a lot of information or rather be able to retrieve it. On the other hand, probably after that quiz, and I quizzed you again, you would have learned the things that you missed or the things that you had been tested on. So that's why things like practice are really, really important. The size of the unit that we are teaching in a training session or a development session is also important. So basically, how much are you going to teach people? And this really depends on the nature of the task at hand or what it is you are trying to teach people. So if I'm teaching someone how to ride a bike, for instance, it probably doesn't make sense to focus on just pedaling for a day or two and then how to maneuver the handlebars. It's much better to just put them on a bike and teach them as they go, doing everything all at once, because ultimately when you're riding a bike, you're not manipulating things separately, you're manipulating them together. However, if I'm teaching you to sail, it doesn't make sense for a number of reasons to put you in a boat and expect you to learn everything at once on the fly. Learning how to sail requires learning how to read the winds, learning how to properly put the sails into place, learning how to steer a sailboat, learning how to interact in the appropriate calls with the other people on your sailboat so you can communicate, understanding and reading flags, learning how to tie knots. You can't possibly learn how to do this all at once on the fly, and you would have to have separate units on each of those different tasks, or rather each of those different knowledge, skills, and abilities and tasks. Fun story, I once sunk a sailboat when I was at a summer camp, and going to prove that learning to sail is much harder than it looks and probably shouldn't be trusted to people under the age of 18. So size of unit. So it's also related to a question of mass practice versus distributed practice. So mass practice is what a lot of organizations do. Some of you have probably been through this, where you do a 1-day or 2-day training or a retreat even, and you do everything all at once in one big chunk, and there's minimal follow-up on it. And if there is, it's perfunctory. In other words, it's just kind of a hand wave at following up and trying to re-emphasize the information. The hard part about those trainings, and one of the reasons people become so disillusioned with them, is they believe they don't work. The reason they don't work is because of this minimal follow-up. You can't expect people to just do a training and retain things and be able to utilize what they've learned if you're not encouraging them to practice and apply what they have learned. Trainings are useless if there's no follow-up. Distributed practice, on the other hand, is more effective because you're doing things over time, and people are much better at retaining things if you do them, practice over time, multiple times. However, it's much harder to do and more expensive because it usually does take more time. So pros and cons to each of these. Like I said, this massed practice approach, it's effective in terms of, or rather, it's efficient in terms of time and money. Is it as effective? Not as well. It gets complicated, but not as much as distributed practice in terms of transfer to the workplace. The next thing we have to consider in encouraging our employees to learn is meaningfulness of material. It isn't about the material making a personal or valuable impact per se, rather it's about doing things like providing an overview of what people are going to study, which is what I did at the beginning of this lecture. Examples that resonate with people. So if you're talking to nurses, talk about interacting with patients, talk about interacting with doctors. It make sense to talk to nurses about interacting with car salesmen, for example, unless the car salesman's in the hospital. It also is important to make sure that the material being taught in the training is appropriate and in a logical sequence. So for example, in terms of trying to learn how to sail, it would probably make sense to start with things like learning the winds and learning different flag signals and learning different knots before you start to learn how to actually pull up the sails and properly rig a boat or rig a vessel, and before you learn then how to steer a vessel. So that's why you would need proper logical sequencing. Otherwise, it's going to negatively impact learning. Related to learning too is practice and overlearning. So you can't possibly practice too much unless of course it leads to burnout. We don't want our employees to experience burnout, so we don't want to over practice them to the point of them hating the material and resenting you for making them do it. But you probably can't encourage your employees to develop themselves enough and to practice their skills enough. And the practice, of course, needs to be appropriate. Going back to active learning, you need to make sure that the practice is actually something that is encouraging them to make new connections, to integrate their knowledge more and apply their knowledge more. So practice needs to be appropriate. It can't just be, here's the textbook from your training, read it again, and that's enough. No, it has to be engaging. It also has to be appropriate to the context. So it, once again, has to be relevant to the work that people are doing. Practice also needs to be accurate. So in this case, what we need is, if the practice is being moderated or mediated by someone within an organization or within the training organization, it actually needs to be reinforcing the knowledge. So actually requiring some sort of testing, or like I said, application, something that encourages you to demonstrate what you know and realize what you don't know. It's also important for practice to not lead to bad practices. So what I mean here is that if you are being observed by someone, they need to be able to correct you where you are making mistakes. So the book gives the example of UPS delivery person not lifting a package properly, if no one's correcting that delivery person on their poor form, then that's just going to lead them to bad practices down the line. So we need to correct people with accurate information when they make mistakes. Okay. So the whole goal of practicing and practicing and practicing is that you want to overlearn. Overlearn in this sense being learning to the point of automaticity. So you basically do things automatically. Now think back to when you were learning how to drive, how the first time, how thoughtful you were, hopefully, how deliberate you were about the rules, hopefully, and how many hours you logged under the watchful eye of an adult, once again, hopefully. And now it's probably second nature to you. You drive home without even realizing what you've done. Some of you, I mean, we've all been there, probably multitasking while you're driving because it's now so automatic to you. And this is because you've probably spent, you did, at least where I grew up, spent hours and 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 hours doing instruction. And every time you got in the car, you learned, you were applying your knowledge about how to drive a car. If any of you have gone an extremely long time without driving, I know I did during certain periods of the shutdown and pandemic response and quarantine. You go sometimes a month without driving your car. You may find yourself back to that square one, or that feeling of, how do I do this again? What are the rules? How do I break my car? And so the goal of learning and making sure your employees are learning and practicing what they've supposedly been trained on is that they will always have that automaticity, and that it's not an experience of, wait, what did they tell me I was supposed to do here? Or I got to get the book so I know what I need to be doing here. This is what we want from our workers is instead a ready knowledge that they can apply. So for example, we'll talk about diversity training in a second. We want people who know right away what to do and how to apply the principles of diversity training, rather than people who would say, give me a second because I'm going to go look it up online. Remember, I mentioned earlier in the class that people are not going to pay you to look stuff up online. Anyone can do that. People are going to pay you to not only have certain knowledge, but to be readily able to apply that knowledge in certain contexts. That's why we train our employees. We encourage them to overlearn to the point of automaticity, because we don't want them to be wasting time saying to themselves, now, what did the book say? What did the training manual say? I think I've forgotten it. Let me go back. Then you've wasted your money, and now we're just engaging in a time-wasting exercise. Feedback is also a very critical principle of learning, as well as motivation, which we will talk about later in this semester. So feedback relates to knowledge of results. Do you know how you performed? Workers need feedback that is timely, so it needs to come soon after they've performed something so they can think back immediately to what they did and know what you're talking about. Many of us have been in that situation where we don't get feedback until weeks later, and you say, well, I don't even know what this person is talking about, so I'm just in one ear out the other. Whereas if you talk to someone, immediately after or a day after, they can say, oh yeah, I remember what I was thinking, what I was feeling, what my thought process was, and you can better then respond to the feedback because you can better internalize it, better integrate it into your understanding of what to do in the future. It also has to be useful. So you actually have to provide feedback that the people can use. So giving them specific tools, specific guidelines and guidance about how to improve in the future. Like I said, it's important for it to generally follow the behavior in question. So whatever it is you're trying to train them on doing or what we're observing at a given time. Positive and negative feedback is good. You can't just give people positive or negative feedback. You have to give both when appropriate. I mean, sometimes you have people who do things perfectly, but it always has to be sensitive, especially in terms of the negative feedback. Just because someone did poorly doesn't mean you are entitled to be a jerk to them. So specific feedback is critical too. This is not something that necessarily gets brought up explicitly in the textbook, and we will revisit this when we talk about goals, but when you are a manager or a coach or a supervisor or even just a friend, giving feedback to people that is specific is really important to help them learn. If you just say to me, do better, that's useless. I need you to tell me specifically how to do better. So if you're training me on diversity and inclusion initiative, or how to be a more inclusive individual, you may say to me, oh, just do better next time. The way you responded to her wasn't really all that appropriate. So just, you got to do better. You would say to that person, well, what am I supposed to do with that? Instead, what would be more useful is to say, here you used an outdated terminology for a particular group of people that's going to probably alienate the person. So you want to make sure, to the extent possible, that you stay up to date on the on the accepted terms to refer to certain groups of people. Or they might say, well, here you were really good about listening to her and paying attention to what she was saying, but in this situation, you use some harmful stereotypes about the group that she belongs to. So don't rely on those when having conversations with people dealing with racial and ethnic issues. Those would be examples of specific feedback that would be actionable. I'd say, okay, I need to be more up to date about what are the appropriate terms to use for various groups of people. That's actionable. Telling me to do my best, you might as well have said nothing. Without feedback, training, and good feedback at that, training is useless. If you don't give people feedback about how they did in a training, where they did well, where they need to improve, you have wasted everybody's time and your money. So when you are identifying trainings for your employees or even developing your own, feedback needs to be a part of it. Without feedback, we can't learn. And if you don't get feedback, then you're also not going to be motivated to improve where you have done poorly. So as I emphasize here, without feedback, training is effectively useless. So there are also some characteristics about the people who are receiving the training and the people who are giving it that can make the training more or less effective and sticky, in the sense that it actually sticks with people. So what kind of people do best at receiving a training? Well, people who are ready to be trained, people have they're basically primed to be trained. They're open to the training. They're interested in the training. They also have enough of the baseline knowledge, skills, and abilities to be able to be trained. Going back to the example of someone learning how to sail a boat, you may say, well, we need people who at least can swim, probably. People who know how to put on a life jacket. If someone doesn't have those even basic skills, then they probably aren't ready to be trained how to sail a boat. We'd have to tackle those things first. Or if you have someone who says, I'm not really interested in learning how to sail a boat, well, they're not ready to be trained then. What kind of other people do best at receiving a training? People who are high in self-efficacy, so people who have a perception that they are capable of doing things tend to do better at training. People who have the motivation to be successful at training tend to do better. People who are high in cognitive ability, openness, and emotional stability also tend to do better at training. There's one thing, as I said before, that I want you to take away from this class. It's that people who are high in cognitive ability tend to do well in organizations, both in terms of their job performance as well as their performance in training. This probably also gets into some of the Dunning-Kruger effect research that we saw. People who are higher in cognitive ability are more likely to know where they need to be improved. People who are lower in cognitive ability are probably unlikely to be able to assess when and where they need to be improved. And therefore, the training on people who are low in cognitive ability may not be as effective, which is unfortunate and ironic because they are the people who need it most. Now, what kind of people do best at providing a training? What makes a good trainer? Are you saying to yourself, I'm intrigued, Dr. Thornton-Lugo, by the fact that you said that training and development is where the money is. Do I have what it takes to be a trainer? You might. People who are good at training are people who provide specific objectives, like I mentioned earlier in terms of specific feedback. They're good at communicating with other people. These are people who also have knowledge of learning processes. So if you're a psych major, you're actually in a really good spot if you've taken any classes on learning or cognition, because you understand how human beings learn and how they can enrich their learning. Another thing that's important, and this probably relates to some level of emotional intelligence and interpersonal skills, is that a good trainer is skilled in idiosyncratic, so various approaches that are well suited to the trainee. So not every training and development procedure is going to be well suited for everyone. So a good trainer is someone who not only knows those different training techniques, but is able to identify and match them with the trainee, the person that they're training. So will training make a difference? So if you are in an organization that says, we have a problem, we need to fix it, you may say, well, will training make a difference? Will there be a transfer of the training to the workplace? Is this worth the time, money, and investment that we will put into implementing a training? Well, when we're evaluating whether there's been an effective training, we look at two things: positive transfer and negative transfer. Positive transfer being when we see what was being taught in the training is being manifested in the job. Negative transfer being when effectively performance declines due to training or in spite of training. So you can make sure, though, that the training goes well by doing the following, or identifying a program that does the following. So the training and the job should take place in a similar environment. So you should make sure that when you are training people on a specific skill set or knowledge set, that it's taking place in an environment that's similar to the one they're working in. If you're trying to train nurses on team coordination and team skills, it's probably best to try and mimic, say, an emergency room or a surgery theater, if you will. It wouldn't make sense to try and have them do team coordination in an escape room, no matter how fun that sounds in a world where we can't do escape rooms safely. So this gets into the identical elements theory, that you want to have elements in the training that are identical or near identical to the elements in the person's job. Active practice, we've already talked about, but just to reiterate, a good training program is one that encourages practice that is active and engaged. Things like problem solving, testing people, having them integrate their knowledge and enrich their knowledge by trying different methods of applying the skills that they're supposed to be learning. You can practice in different contexts. So of course this still has to be related to the job though. So in the case of a nurse, you may say, okay, let's do this under the context of you are working in a heart surgery, a cardiovascular surgery versus an orthopedic surgery. I'm not a medical doctor, I just have a PhD. So if I'm messing up terms here, I apologize to anybody who is pre-med here. But it's also be related to the job though. So we wouldn't once again have the nurses go to an escape room or go and try to coordinate in an automotive mechanics business. Just wouldn't make sense for a nurse to go into those contexts. The content and the KSAOs need to be related to the job in question. So team coordination makes sense for a nurse. They have to be able to coordinate well when someone's life is at stake, and they need to be able to develop that shorthand, the team mental shortcuts and heuristics that enable them to team mental models. So I was looking for team mental models and allow them to work well together. It wouldn't make sense to say teach nurses about necessarily innovation and creativity. They aren't really expected to be creative, rather they're expected to follow procedures and guidelines. And for the record, this isn't to say, and I know we have a couple of nursing practitioners here in the class, it's not to say that nurses aren't creative people. It's just that the job often does not necessitate creativity as much as it probably necessitates things like knowledge of medical procedures and coordination with other people. Expectations also have to be clear. So it's really important in the training to make sure that your trainees know what they are expected to get out of. It basically sort of primes the pump, if you will, and gives your trainees the cognitive structure to understand what it is they're supposed to take away from it. Throwing people into a training session where they have no idea what am I supposed to, with regard to what they're supposed to walk away with, really, it's almost a baptism by fire, but in the worst way possible, because they may walk out and still say, I don't know what I was supposed to get from there. If you say to, the team of nurses, again, who are going through a training, by the end of this training, you all should be able to communicate with each other effectively, prepare an operating room for a particular procedure, operate on this dummy effectively in a 2-hour time span, and make minimal to no errors, then it will give them a good idea of like, what am I supposed to walk away from this training with? And then it can tell them, and it basically gives them a cognitive structure to understand, okay, this thing relates to this objective, this thing relates to that objective, and they can start mentally organizing what they are learning, and by virtue of that organization, actually be able to retrieve it and apply it better in the future. Another way that we can make sure our training goes well is, as I said, maintenance after training. You want to keep encouraging people to practice, engaging in continuing education. So follow-up training is almost like boosters to a vaccine. You have to keep things up in order for them to be effective. Transfer climate is about support. So is the organization supportive of the training that they get? This is really critical. And you think, if the organization is spending so much money, why would we not be supportive of it? The organization or HR may be supportive of the training, but I'm sure many of you have experienced this, where you go and get a training, or you will experience it for the record. You go and get a training and you come back and your supervisor or your colleagues who didn't maybe go through the training with you feel like whatever you have learned is useless, or say, you know what, that's how you learned it in the training, but that's not how we're going to do it here. So in that way, you've spent all this money, this person has gone out, learned a bunch of new KSAOs, and they've come back and they've basically been said, leave that at the door, we don't want it here. That happens a lot more than you think. So it's critical to make sure that in the organization, you have buy-in from the people that your trainees, the people who are being trained, the people who they work with, you have buy-in from the people who the trainees work with. Sorry, lost it there. You have buy-in from the people that the trainees work with. Otherwise, it's just going to be, once again, a waste of time and money. And we really want to avoid that, because training can be useful. So who does better at transfer? Once again, people who are higher in cognitive ability are better able to transfer what they learn in a training to the workplace. People who are high in conscientiousness generally also tend to do better at transferring their training learning, or what they've learned during training, to the workplace. And making training voluntary is actually really critical. This is hard, for the record, because sometimes we do need to do mandatory trainings. Going back to the example of Michael Sky, if you find that your employees are engaging in sexual harassment, you have to nip that in the bud. You can't afford to say, oh, well, voluntary trainings tend to produce better outcomes than those that are involuntary, because you could find yourself at the receiving end of an EEOC lawsuit. However, voluntary participation, though, you don't have the ability to basically say, in some situations, we would prefer people to be voluntary in terms of their engagement in training. On the flip side, if you require too much training, or not too much training, but if you require a training, people are resentful of it, and they aren't open to receiving the feedback. They aren't open to engaging in the training, and therefore the training may once again be a waste of time and money. So this is a really double-edged sword here. And you, when you are working in an organization, have to decide, what trade-offs are worth it here and what risks are worth it. Sometimes you just need to force people to go through a training because the risks are too great to tolerate. On the other hand, if there's some level, if it's not as necessary for the training to take place, you could have it be voluntary. The reason also that voluntary participation works better is because when people engage in voluntary training, they've already basically begun a process of cognitive buy-in that makes them more open and receptive to what's going on in the training. So this is brought up about diversity training, but if someone voluntarily decides to go through a diversity training, it basically signals to themselves, their behavior signals, hey, I must value diversity if I am willingly going to a diversity training. And so part of this effectively cognitive dissonance reduction process that we engage in, we basically look at our behaviors and say, well, what does that say about me? What does that say about my attitudes? If I'm voluntarily doing something, then that must say something about my relationship with that thing, be it, deciding to improve myself on a particular KSAO or engaging in a diversity training and trying to be a more inclusive individual. So in short, if you allow people to voluntarily participate in training, they are more open and receptive to that training. They identify themselves as valuing whatever is being taught in the training. And because of those things, they're more likely to learn and transfer the knowledge to the workplace. Okay, so you are convinced that training is worth it. Well, how should you provide your training? What should you do? What tactics do people use to deliver a training? So one is lecturing. It's what I do in this class. It's basically kind of a stand and deliver thing. Of course, a good lecture is one that involves some sort of integrative activity. If I were doing this class fully in person and synchronous, which is what you would be doing in an in-person class, our activities that we do every Thursday would be spread out throughout every lecture, so it gets broken up. And so you are pausing, integrating your knowledge, applying it, and then we move on and we do the next thing. But some lectures are pretty much, straightforward, information dump, Q&A. Those are cost effective, but they may not be the most engaging and therefore encouraging of learning processes. So you always want to be aware of these trade-offs that happen when you're trying to provide a training to people. So we can also do on-the-job training. A lot of you have probably been through this. I certainly have. Certainly didn't feel like it was training at the time. But on-the-job training is where you learn on the job how to do a particular task, how you learn certain knowledge, skills, and abilities. Often though, and usually it's with an incumbent, so someone who already has a position. So you're basically doing a job shadow while you are also supposed to be doing the job. Here you can see a couple of baristas doing exactly that. So one barista is learning from another about how to, it looks like, operate a cash register. So this is an example of on-the-job training. Often though, on-the-job training is done haphazardly. As I was laughing earlier, that's exactly what I was thinking of, that a lot of on-the-job trainings are not well thought out. And organizations don't think about formalizing it. They just say, hey, John, you're supposed to teach Mary here about how to do this, and just go for it. There's no manual, there's no training for the trainers. And there's no identification of who might be a better trainer. So John may be a terrible trainer, because if we go back to the traits that people have who are better at training, John may be someone who has no knowledge of learning processes and is really bad at communicating with other people. It's just not a good people person. So if you put John in charge of the training, even if you have a pretty good formalized setup, John may just be really, really bad at it. So in that way, with on-the-job training, it can be very useful and effective. We just need to make sure we're doing a more formalized and thought out and less haphazard approach to it. So self-directed training is another training approach. Um, some trainings for things like at my prior university, every year we had to do compliance training. So that was basically a rules and ethics training, and that was a self-directed training. So it's usually programmed. So there's a clear, program of study, if you will, chapters, lessons, modules that you have to go through with quizzes. Um, Sometimes the programmed instruction can be about and I should say the program instruction, like I said, it's usually with specific modules. They go in an order. There's usually testing at the end of every unit. Computer assisted instruction is just basically doing the same with a computer. So it's most self-directed trainings now would be done through computer assisted instruction. So at this point, making the distinction isn't really worthwhile, but it's important to note that I guess you could have programmed instruction that is self-directed through a manual that doesn't involve a computer. So the problems is it's not necessarily more effective than a training that's directed or managed by someone else. And the issue here is that it's entirely contingent on the trainee's ability to learn, to hold themselves accountable, to not cheat on quizzes. If you've gone through enough of these compliance trainings, if you've worked in an organization where you're familiar with the ethics training or the rules training or the handbook training you have to go through every year, you just click through the modules and answer the questions at the end of the quiz because you've assumed that you've learned everything. And so that's a huge problem with self-directed trainings, is that it's really contingent on the trainee's ability, and to some extent it's not listed here, but motivation to learn. If those two things are lacking, well then the training isn't really going to stick and transfer. Virtual reality training is something that is also growing in popularity. With VR, you becoming more sophisticated, you can actually do this in the workplace. That's what we can see right here in this picture of someone doing a VR training with a barista. When the book was written, I think it still had a more old school concept of what VR training looked like, where it was probably just in a room where you couldn't actually engage with the materials and the context that you would be working in. We'll show what that looks like in a second. But you do need physical fidelity when it comes to VR. So you basically need whatever is being shown in the VR headset to look as close to what we would see in reality as possible, which we do have here. The person is working in a coffee shop. We also need psychological fidelity in the sense that, are the behavioral and psychological processes similar? So are you doing this exact same behaviors that you would physically and mentally as you would on the job? If not, then it's not really faithful to the psychological context of the work. Similarly, we have psychological processes. So if you have a VR training that involves interacting with non-human persons, so robots or AIs, or a predetermined prompt, much like you do in a video game, you may say, okay, I know I'm talking to a robot. I'm not going to treat this the same way psychologically as I would if I knew I were talking to a person. So in that way, the fidelity of VR could be limited. So these are things we need to ask ourselves. Like, VR is a cool way to do a training, but are we compromising these really critical features of physical and psychological fidelity that would limit the transferability of a VR training to the workplace? We can also have VR trainings that use gamification. Here we see this for military practices using VR training as opposed to going out into the field and actually doing a training. This is, like I said, where we've actually removed a context and you're usually just in a room and you're just looking at what you see in your headset. Gamification is where you use games in VR for the purpose of training. And while it has a positive impact on trainee attitudes, people do respond positively to things like VR training, and particularly gamification. Transfer to the workplace can sometimes be minimal because we're not always playing a game. It's where this fidelity issue comes up. In short, much like interviews, you have to be thoughtful about using games in VR when training. Just using it because it's hot and cool and a sexy, fun thing doesn't mean that it will necessarily work, and you could end up spending a lot of money doing it for very little gain. Multimedia techniques are those that use videos that involve lessons or training activities. So a lot of you have or will go through this where you watch a video with an example or a conversation or a vignette that you're supposed to see and then evaluate or respond to, or it's supposed to illustrate a key training concept. It's frequently used in things like sexual harassment training, which we can see here, or diversity training. And these things still work. People do respond positively to videos that can actually show us something that we can't necessarily intuitively understand by just looking at a book or reading a training manual. The book makes a distinction between distance and e-learning. I'm just going to put them together here because at this point, most of our distance learning is mediated through the internet. So the distance learning is basically when you aren't doing learning in the same physical location. Most distance learning, therefore, is e-learning, just given the world that we live in. E-learning is when it's delivered using online platforms and online content. So that's also where it gets blurry, because you could have a learning situation where you are communicating via something like Zoom, but none of your material is actually delivered through an online portal other than the video communication. So it's pretty complicated and blurry, and that's why I just combine them together. Though there are benefits like greater autonomy and learner control, as we have learned, it requires diligence and self-direction. Many of you have shared that this is hard. It's hard to hold yourself accountable. And this being online learning right now in college, what a lot of the principles we're talking about here, they apply to what you're going through right now and what you go through in your college education as well. And so here, much like training in the workplace, or much like rather learning in this class, training in the workplace for using distance learning and e-learning, it requires diligence, self-direction, self-motivation, and self-accountability, which not all of us have. I certainly would not have had it as a 18-year-old in starting my first year of college, and it's therefore really hard. Many employees also don't have the diligence or the self-control to be able to engage in e-learning either. After all, what are you going to pay more attention to? A funny video that you saw on YouTube or the training video that you're supposed to be paying attention to? So pros and cons, though. People do respond positively to this because it gives them autonomy. When you give people autonomy, they respond positively. But autonomy comes with a lot of drawbacks and a trust in the person's ability to not exploit that independence that they have. So how else can we train employees and basically give them knowledge, skills, and abilities that we would like them to have? Well, one way that organizations do this is through orientation and socialization. Organizational socialization refers to how you learn about an organization, about its culture and about its values, as well as the attitudes and behaviors that people typically display. It's often achieved through orientations, which can sometimes be anywhere from an hour-long to a multi-day program of events, sessions, and whatnot, where you learn about a company, not only the rules and regulations, but what it's like to work there. This is effectively the first impression beyond what you had during your recruitment and selection process of the organization. Another way that we can engage in organizational socialization beyond orientations is through things like peer mentors. So a peer mentor can often give you an idea of the ropes, guide you in an organization, give you advice, and teach you about the organization. Another way that we can train people in organizations is through coaching. Coaching is not to actually be confused. Well, I just contradicted myself. The book notes that coaching should not actually be confused with training. It's almost like training adjacent. It also shouldn't be confused with leadership. A coach does provide guidance to people. They help facilitate problem solving and performance. They, give the employee best practices, recommendations. They also inspire the employee to perform better. But a coach in an organization is much like a coach in an athletic team. The coach basically equips people with the advice and guidance that he or she or they need to do their job, but they often aren't micromanaging. So they're also not a manager or supervisor. This is not someone who's telling you what to do or how to do it. They're just there to guide you, give you the skills, tools that you need, and they basically let you go and leave you to your own devices to then figure it out on your own. So another thing about coaches is that an employee's receptiveness to the coach and to their feedback, it's critical for it to work. So an employee will not respond well to a coach if they aren't receptive to it, much like a training program as well. So an employee must therefore have that readiness, a good compatibility with the coach. Sometimes that's even just demographic compatibility, so same gender, same race, same ethnicity. And they also need to have a good relationship with the coach. So even if we don't match on our demographics, as long as we have a good, solid relationship, we will probably have a good coach and coach-e relationship, and therefore the coaching will be effective in teaching the employee things. Executive coaching is just a specific kind of coaching where you coach an executive, so someone who's in top management, a vice president, a CEO, CFO, etc., on being better at their job, or it's part of a training and development program or succession planning. So whoever's going to take over for top management, you do executive coaching ahead of time so they're prepared to take over for those upper level organizational positions. This is also where a lot of the money in training and development is, because people pay a lot of money for these programs. Behavior modeling is another way that we can learn in organizations. It's not formalized usually, though you can do social learning in training programs. Social learning is where we basically learn by observation. So we see what others do, and by virtue of what happens to them, if they have successes or failures, we learn either to do that thing or not to do that thing, respectively. So we can use social learning in formalized ways. Like I said, watching a video of someone engaging in certain behaviors gives us a model by which we can model our own behaviors and try to emulate what they do. It can also happen, as I said, through informal channels. If I see my coworker displaying a behavior and she gets rewarded for it, I'm going to learn that I should engage in that behavior as well. So like I said, it can be both informal and formal. We can also have business simulations. Here I would say that these are most strongly related to or similar to assessment centers, which we have talked about in this class in terms of a selection tool. But there are assessment centers that are used for training and development. These are called developmental assessment centers. So rather than using an assessment center to identify who would be well suited for a job, you use the assessment center to identify what KSAOs they possess, and then you give them feedback on how to improve upon it. I personally have been an assessor and a coach in such a developmental assessment center company. So if any of you are interested in that, I'd be happy to share more about it. But the way these work is you go through a simulation of a business, you're given a lot of background information that you can read up on, and then you go through the assessment center, you make decisions, you're given certain tasks to do, we look at what you do, what you choose to prioritize, what you don't. In the book, it describes the business simulations as being competitive. Developmental assessment centers aren't competitive, but business simulations can be. There may be a prize involved at the end. So that's one distinction between a business simulation and a developmental assessment center. Corporate universities are also used to train and develop employees. It's part of the socialization process, so the process by which you learn about your organization, but they also provide training opportunities as well. People sometimes go to their corporate universities to do specific trainings, and they keep it all in-house, which can really help cultivate a certain culture. It creates pride to go through your company's university, etc. They are often in person, though some do their trainings online now, especially with COVID, but the in-person dynamic also serves to reinforce the organization's socialization process. The last question we will ask, I believe, about assessing a training is, does my training work? So I've followed the best practices. I remember what happened in this class. I developed a training, or my organization is using a training. How do we know if it worked? How do we know if this investment was even worth it? Well, we can do studies. This goes back and links back to our discussions of research methods. So if you're thinking a lot of this sounds familiar, that's why. So we can assess based on certain criteria. In your book, there are two outlined. These are the Kirkpatrick, and I'll circle here, the Kirkpatrick criteria. Okay, let's see if it does it. Nope, not working. But the Kirkpatrick criteria and the augmented criteria. They're basically effectively the same, just different terms for what there is. Under Kirkpatrick, we have 4 criteria: reactions, learning, behavioral criteria, and results. Under augmented, we have affective reactions, utility judgments, immediate knowledge, knowledge retention, behavior skill demonstration, transfer, and results. So here for reactions across both of these, we can have things like trainee attitude, so attitudes here as well. And then under the augmented criteria, we also have utility judgments. So so first attitudes and feelings being about the training itself, but then also beliefs about how much did this transfer to my work and was it actually useful on the part of the employee. Then we have learning, which can just be judged by how much material was actually learned. And then multiple ways we can break this down. So tests of the knowledge immediately following the training, tests of the knowledge, say a few weeks or months later, and then having the employee demonstrate the behaviors that they have learned in a training to show that they actually know what they're doing and they just can't, that they just aren't, or rather they are not just capable of circling the right answers on a test. We also have behavioral outcomes, so changes at the job here. So do we actually see here, this is for the record, a behavior demonstration in the training. Here this is, are we actually seeing changes on the job itself? Same here with transfer, so just are we seeing the employee change their behaviors at work? Then we have results, so what value, and this is the same across the board here, what value does this have to the company, usually in terms of things like, was it worth the investment? So how to evaluate? The best way is to do a quasi-experiment. And you may say to me, Dr. Thornton-Lugo, I remember you said that the best kind of study to do was a true experiment with randomization. And you are right. But quasi-experiments are true experiments are extremely hard to do in an organization. Imagine, if you will, you randomly select certain employees across various units in an organization and you give them a training, and then you want to see if that training will be effective. Well, and versus people who didn't go through the training. Well, I would venture to guess that the people who go through the training are going to share what they go through on the training with people in their unit. And they might share some tips and tricks that they learned, and then their fellow employees say, I'm going to start doing that too. So you may see that everybody's performance gets better because there's basically a contamination effect. And this is why we would probably want to do something like quasi-experiments, where we put an entire unit in a training together and compare it to a unit that would presumably not have a lot of interaction with these people, and see whether the unit that went through the training improved compared to the other unit. Of course, we'd decide randomly, so we'd probably flip a coin or use a random number generator to decide which unit got the training and which did it. And presumably we'd eventually give the other unit the training if we found that it worked. But we don't do randomization across those 2 units in terms of picking out different people from each unit, because we could have that contamination effect. We also could effectively have an extinction effect, where people, because you only have one person going through the training, if they don't experience that transfer climate or that support, then the benefits of the training are effectively knocked out by the context they return to. So quasi-experiments are probably a better way to do a test of whether a training is effective. So some of the ways we can do this if we don't do a quasi-experiment is just a pre-post test design. So you measure people before and after a training. So let's say we have everyone in the company go through a training. We could do a pre and post test training. So let's say we have everybody go through a diversity training. We give them a test of diversity and inclusion before training. They go through the training, test again, and hopefully we see the scores improve. But there are a lot of questions about this. What if everyone going through the training just learned collectively irrespective of the training? So the training didn't do anything. It's just that we're all going through a cultural shift. Or imagine that you were a company that was having a diversity and inclusion training whilst the Black Lives Matter protests began to pick up earlier this year. You may have found some changes in the effectiveness of, or rather your employees' scores on their diversity and inclusion tests, but that might have been irrespective of the training and due to everything going on in our culture right now. So that's why doing a pre-post test design might not be beneficial. It's also possible that if we do a pre-post test design, that giving people that first diversity and inclusion questionnaire, they now know what questions are going to be asked again in the future. And so they've basically, they haven't necessarily learned what to do from the training and how to apply that in the workplace. They just have anticipated your questions now and know how to answer them appropriately. So that's why we would maybe do a pre-post test design with a control group. So we have a control group, another group that doesn't go through the training, and so people who just don't go through the training. And we also do a pre-post test. So we give them a test. One group goes through the training, another group doesn't. We give them the test again. And then we compare the two groups. We would want to see that the training group does better than the control group. However, we still don't know if by virtue of introducing the test that first time around, are people just showing that they've learned how to beat the test, not actually learned because of the training. So that's when we would do a Solomon 4-group design. Look in your book to see this in a visual form. But you add another control group, so a group that doesn't go through the training, and another experimental group, a group that does go through the training. But you only measure those people post-training, so you only measure them after the training. That way we can see, okay, do we not only see that the pre and post people, the pre and post experimental group does better than the group that did not go through the training, but do we also see that a group that did not get the measure or the test before their training also did better than a group that did not get the test before a training and did not go through the training. So basically, we just isolate that the or demonstrate that the training is what's actually operating here, and that it's not just what we call a cohort effect. So everybody's going through the same thing and therefore developing irrespective of the training, and it's not because of a learning effect. So people aren't just learning how to beat the test they were originally given before the training. All right, let's talk about sexual harassment and diversity training. You may be saying to yourself, Dr. Thornton-Lugo, given what I've been reading in the news, I don't think I have to do this anymore, because there are certain powerful people who are saying, and let me move my little thing because I have a lot of news clips to show you, or or headlines to show you. You may be saying, the president says I don't have to. And while you may be a federal contractor or a federal worker, and you may be appropriately interpreting the executive order that the president came out with, there are going to be some problems with that, which I will get to in a second. But you may be saying, do I still need to do this because the president doesn't say that diversity, or the president is saying that diversity and inclusion training, or the ones that he does not care for, are not effective and shouldn't be introduced into federal workplaces. You may have seen arguments that diversity programs don't even work, that they are useless. So even if you believe in diversity and you say, look, I don't necessarily agree with the president, but I've been through a diversity training and I thought it was garbage and it didn't do anything in my organization. And you may also say, look, Dr. Thornton-Lugo, or look, HR manager at my company, racism is dead. We elected a Black president, and we don't have to do anything about our diversity and inclusion training. America is no longer racist, and America is no longer sexist. Well, diversity training does have a real and meaningful impact in the workplace. And in high stakes situations like healthcare, where we know that systemic racism and bias actually leads to existential outcomes, so differences in the morbidity of certain people, then we definitely need to have diversity training. We know, for example, that Black mothers are far more likely to die in childbirth than other ethnic groups. And we have to ask ourselves in that situation, when it comes to human lives and human deaths, both the deaths of mothers as well as potentially the children they are carrying, whether we should be doing more to encourage an understanding of racism and bias and prejudice and how it's leading to those effects. This is something I could go on and on about. I took an entire class when I was an undergrad about systemic disparities in the healthcare system. And if you're not convinced it exists, I'd be happy to send you about 20 or so articles documenting that it does. So in these contexts, it is extremely important to develop and implement and utilize diversity trainings, because it can mean the difference between someone living and someone dying. And 1,000 times, yes, do you need to do these things? Because even if you think that racism and sexism are gone, they most decidedly are not. In terms of sexism, Silicon Valley has a huge sexual harassment problem. That is one of the many reasons that Uber's CEO was kicked out of his job, was because his company handled sexual harassment so poorly. Google has had issues with this as well. And so we need to be asking ourselves realistically, are these things actually gone? Because though the punditry would tell you that things like sexism and racism aren't that big of a deal, the lived experiences of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Americans say otherwise. And though I will offer as we go through some of the more instrumental and financial motives for engaging in diversity training and sexual harassment training, the fact of the matter stands that women are people, and usually when we're talking about sexual harassment training, we're talking about the disproportionately negative treatment of women in the workplace, though this can be extended to LGBTQIA status as well if we interpret certain Supreme Court rulings in a certain way. But people have dignity. All people have dignity. And so in that way, things like sexual harassment training and diversity and inclusion training recognize the inherent dignity in all people. So if that isn't convincing, like I said, we'll talk about some of the financial motives for engaging in diversity and inclusion training. But it is always important to do these things because people are worth investing in. It's worth investing in your employees to make sure they treat other people with respect and acknowledge and appreciate the dignity that they have been given as human beings. Okay, that was my little brief soapbox about harassment trainings and diversity and inclusion training. So let's talk about sexual harassment. Recall that sexual harassment is a form of gender-based discrimination. It has an impact on work outcomes, so employees who experience sexual harassment do see decreased work performance. And for the record, as I said, usually when people are talking about sexual harassment, they're talking about the negative treatment of women in the workplace, but it is basically any form of sex-based or gender-based treatment that negatively impacts your work. So men can be sexually harassed in the workplace. It's not just women. So it can cut both ways. So it does impact work outcomes. It impacts psychological and somatic outcomes. So things like attitudes, as well as things like stress and employee heart rates. It can also impact organizational outcomes, so it can be very costly. Even if you don't get sued, if you have a toxic work culture where sexual harassment is rampant, your employees are not performing as well, and therefore you're not making as much money as you otherwise could have. So how can you prevent sexual harassment? Well, one way is not blaming the victim. And for the record, trainings will encourage and teach people these principles. So not blaming the victim, defining sexual harassment clearly in company policies and teaching employees about those policies, changing the organizational culture, as I just mentioned, to be one that is understanding of and appreciative of the experience of sexual harassment in the sense that you acknowledge that it exists and you try to stop it. And of course, training. Training can produce changes in knowledge, but even change is difficult. So here I want to acknowledge that a sexual harassment training can produce demonstrable differences, but it is hard to change people. As we know, there is a very strong resistance to the idea that we could ever need to be improved, ever. So in that way, employees may be resistant to the trainings that we bring into the workplace. They may say, and I mentioned earlier, openness is critical to the effectiveness of a training. So an employee may say, well, I'm not sexist, so I don't think I need to be here. And given the current cultural climate of, once again, denying that we would ever need to improve on anything, it may be even more difficult to get your employees to buy into the need for change. And that's what ultimately makes the change we want to see from a training difficult to sometimes produce. So the reason why sexual harassment trainings often aren't effective, or rather some of the reasons they can be ineffective in producing change, is because people are resistant to admitting they need to change and to actually doing the things to be better. Sexual harassment training continued. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, does offer training on sexual harassment because they are the people who also handle the cases of sexual harassment. Trainings provide the good part about a training is it also provides a common ground to understand sexual harassment. So somewhat akin to that organizational socialization thing I was talking about, if you give people in your organization a common understanding of what sexual harassment is, then to the extent possible, you've minimized any ambiguity or confusion about sexual harassment in the workplace. It's important because trainings are also important because research has shown that the order in which we receive sexual harassment information influences our interpretation of it. So if you give people a common understanding and a common guideline about how they should understand sexual harassment information and reports, then they are less influenced by their biases and cognitive processes. I'm not sure if we've talked about contrast effects, but a little brief sidebar. Contrast effects suggest that when we have two things contrasted against each other, they can make each other appear more extreme. You know, if you put your hand in a bucket of cold water, like cold ice water, and then lukewarm water, that lukewarm water will seem much warmer than if you had just had it outside at room temperature and put it into that lukewarm water. So the contrast of the cold makes the lukewarm water seem far hotter than it probably actually is. In terms of psychological processes in sexual harassment, what we see is that if I were to, for example, give you a complaint as an HR manager of someone making inappropriate and sexually based comments in the workplace first, and then give you a report of someone being groped in the workplace, you may interpret the groping as being far more egregious than if you had received the groping report before you received the inappropriate comments report. And that's unfortunate because it also results, if you receive the groping report first, in the inappropriate comments report being rated as less egregious. Giving people training then allows you to say, here is what is egregious and here's what isn't, here's what is sexual harassment and here is what isn't. And so a training can give us that common frame of reference and minimize our biases and cognitive processes influencing our evaluation of sexual harassment in the workplace. One drawback of a sexual harassment training is that it can produce false positives of sexual harassment. So you basically find people overreacting to instances of sexual harassment. So they're a little bit more on edge. So you always still have to be careful in responding to that probably oversensitivity or that probable oversensitivity that develops after a training, and just be aware of it when you institute a sexual harassment training. Diversity and inclusion training. Not all diversity and inclusion trainings are created equal. So some diversity and inclusion trainings are based on principles of color blindness. And so research shows that colorblind diversity trainings and just colorblind principles are not very good. This may get at your perception or your experience or that of people you know of these programs not working, because sometimes they are poorly designed. So it's not that we don't need to, say, treat or address sexual harassment or diversity and inclusion because trainings are, because, oh, I went through a training and it didn't do anything for me or it seemed worthless. No, what that just suggests is you need a better training going on. So color blindness, for the record, refers to this approach to diversity and inclusion, which basically seeks to ignore the very real differences, or rather the very real perception of differences between people of different nationalities, different ethnicities, different races, and different colors of skin. So color blindness basically is just that. It's, I don't see color. If you want to see some pretty humorous jokes about this, I recommend looking back at old Colbert Report statements. Stephen Colbert has a few of those. And for the record, Stephen Colbert, when he was on the Colbert Report, was a satire of a conservative pundit. So he's making fun of people who actually genuinely believe those things. A lot of people don't realize that Stephen Colbert was actually making fun of certain types of pundits, but I recommend. He has a lot of statements that reflect what this idea about colorblindness is and what it can mean and some of the problems that get produced when you actually genuinely buy into colorblindness. Like I said, he's a satire. He's making fun of a certain type of person. But colorblindness is just that. It's people saying, oh, I don't see color. When I look at you, I just see a person. And you may say, well, I've said that, and it sounds like you're making fun of me. And I'm not making fun of a person saying that, because for a while, that was what was expected and accepted in terms of diversity and inclusion trainings. This idea that the best way to deal with racism in the workplace was to ignore that we have differences. But the problem with that is when you ignore that we have differences, it also conveniently ignores the impact that those differences have on people. So it would be lovely to live in a world where we could pretend that race does not impact the way people are treated. But unfortunately, it does. Race is a social construct that has very little actual basis in genetic differences. Once again, I'd be happy to send articles on this if you aren't convinced by it. But when it comes to race, though it is a problematic social construct and therefore something that we have developed as a society and not something that's based in genetics and whatnot, though it is a social construct, we still are impacted by it. So to say, well, race is a terrible social construct and I'm just not even going to play into it, once again ignores the fact that some people do think race matters. Some people do think that race should determine how you are treated. Some people think that race should determine what happens to you in this world. And so when you have colorblind diversity and inclusion trainings, like I said, it teaches people to basically ignore those things. One easy way, or rather not easy way, but understandable way that a colorblind diversity and inclusion training can manifest is, let's say a person comes to an HR manager who's just gone through a colorblind training and says, I'm fairly confident that because I am a Latino woman that I am being mistreated in the workplace. And the HR manager says, well, employee, here we don't really believe that race is something that we should pay attention to. And here we have colorblind policy. So I find it really hard to believe that anybody would treat you differently because of your ethnicity or your race. And as I said, we've gone through this training where we say that we just don't pay attention to those things. Here we like to envision a world where those things don't matter. So unfortunately, I'm just going to have to let that one slide. And hopefully you'll learn to see that, these things really shouldn't matter in the long run anyway. That is a very real thing that can happen when people go through these colorblind trainings. It basically gives them the excuse and the infrastructure to ignore when race-based and ethnicity-based complaints that are valid come through their doors. So colorblindness, therefore, is not the same as diversity and multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is what you should be doing in a diversity and inclusion training, which is not that our differences don't exist. It's rather that our differences do exist. They have unfortunately influenced how people treat us, but it is our differences that should be celebrated and embraced, in the sense that these are differences that aren't actually harmful to people. So instead of ignoring that you and I have different cultures and papering over it and saying, we're the same, let's not acknowledge that we have any meaningful cultural differences whatsoever, we say, no, we do have differences and let's talk about them. Once again, this isn't, for the record, saying you and I have differences and my difference is that I deny your humanity as a human being. No, this is differences like, hey, you make this kind of food and you grew up with these cultural values and this is how your family was structured and who lived with you and who didn't and how you celebrated holidays and what does it mean in the world that you look this way and I look that way and how should we try to combat that. So it's not the papering over of differences, which is what happens in colorblindness. It's not, for the record, giving problematic views a seat at the table when they should not really be entertained, especially those views that deny the dignity of other persons. Rather, it's embracing that we are different. Society, unfortunately, sometimes treats us differently because of that. And how can we move forward in a way that's productive, acknowledging that past, but embracing our differences as something to be celebrated. Anti-racism is also different from active diversity and inclusion. So in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of companies have embraced anti-racism training, which is usually a more direct and explicit addressing of what it means to be anti-racist. So actually explicitly anti-racist. But while anti-racism is important because it's a little bit more aggressive and addressing what leads to our need to embrace multiculturalism, in other words, it's addressing why do we even have these diversity and inclusion training programs in the first place. It's because there's racism that impacts the way that people are treated in the workplace. It is different though from active diversity and inclusion. So you could say, I embrace anti-racist values. I am, explicitly saying I am not only, I'm not prejudiced, I'm explicitly anti-racist, I reject that ideology. That's very different than going and starting to be active about, say, developing an affirmative action program, or making sure that the people of color in your workplace feel welcomed, that all differences are celebrated, which, yes, gets into multiculturalism territory, but active diversity and inclusion also makes sure that active diversity and inclusion also makes sure that you are translating your anti-racist views into practices in the workplace. So it's not just enough to possess the beliefs and values, which is what goes on in anti-racism. It's also about actively doing something about it. So, as I said earlier, if the dignity of human beings doesn't compel you, if you, don't feel like that's enough of a reason to engage in sexual harassment training, or in this case, diversity and inclusion training, well, Black, and Indigenous, and people of color will be the majority in the United States by 2044. That's sooner than you think. It just feels like to me that 2000 was just yesterday. So if you think that 20 years can't go by that quickly, they do. Companies will lose great talent if diversity is not addressed. So if you have a poor diversity climate, you will lose great talent. There's a wide world of people out there who look different, who come from different places. And if you do not have an organizational culture that embraces and welcomes them, they will leave your company. And they will go to companies that will do better because they are doing better. You also run the risk of being sued. In a nutshell, if you have a company that isn't engaging in proper anti-racism and active diversity and inclusion, you do run the risk of people doing things like discriminative hiring practices, or producing hiring situations that lead to adverse impact. And so, like I said, if trying to create an organization where the dignity of human beings is respected is not enough, these reasons should hopefully compel you to consider the value of diversity and inclusion training. So what does it involve? A lot of diversity and inclusion trainings people are just super scared of, and it's really unclear why, because diversity and inclusion training usually just involves increasing awareness of issues, trying to acknowledge and reduce your biases and stereotypes, and changing behaviors. Of course, this gets back to that concept of openness before. A lot of people are really uncomfortable with the idea of even acknowledging that you have biases and stereotypes. As a psychologist who has studied stereotypes and prejudices, as psychologists, we acknowledge and embrace and actively try to therefore combat the fact that everyone has prejudices and biases. And some of you might be saying, I'm not prejudiced, I'm not racist, and you might not be actively, but everyone, I mean literally everyone, has implicit biases and implicit stereotypes that we carry with us. Heck, even people of color carry these biases too. The classic studies of African American children choosing white dolls over Black dolls because they were considered more valuable goes to show this, and it's insidious and problematic. So if you're sitting here saying, I'm a good person, I believe in the value of other human beings, I therefore don't think that I need to go through diversity training, you may still benefit from it, because we do have to, being anti-racist is about acknowledging the problematic things that we carry with us. But getting back to the effectiveness of these trainings and why you may be saying to yourself, I've observed these trainings not work, this is also why, because people are really reticent. If you don't think there's anything wrong, people are really reticent to admit that there's anything wrong with them. If you don't think that there's anything wrong with you, then you're not open to the training, and the training's just not going to take root. And if you also don't think that your behaviors need to be changed on top of your attitudes, well, then you're not going to change them. So sometimes in companies, this is where we once again see the lack of effectiveness of diversity and inclusion trainings, because people either don't think that they work and therefore they aren't open to them, or people don't think that they themselves as human beings need to improve upon anything, and then once again the training doesn't work. So diversity and inclusion trainings are not that scary, but because of the reticence that people have to engage in them, we may find that their effectiveness can be limited, and that's really unfortunate. So how can we make this work better? There's a link here to a Harvard Business Review article. I think it's the Harvard Business Review. It's definitely a Harvard affiliated outlet. It's very lengthy, but if training and development is something you are interested in, particularly diversity and inclusion, and you're wondering, why do these things not work, or why have I experienced them not working in my workplace, even if I believe that diversity and inclusion is valuable, I thought this article was actually really good and would be really beneficial. Fair warning, like I said, it's very long. So how can we make these work better? As I mentioned earlier, voluntariness is really critical. You know, people who go into these diversity and inclusion programs voluntarily already are basically saying to themselves, I value this thing, and therefore they're more open to it. If you force people into it, especially people who don't believe that they need to change, well then it's not going to take root. This also, becomes a problem because, once again, getting back to the Dunning-Kruger effect, the people who probably need it the most are the people who are least likely to admit that they either need it or that diversity and inclusion is something that needs to be addressed. Having contact between people is also critical, in the sense that having contact between diverse groups of people is really effective. This is the contact theory. Contact theory is that we can break down prejudices and stereotypes and biases we have against people by virtue of just coming into contact with them. If you had the blessing, as I did, of growing up in a very diverse place, the idea of exclusively white spaces and places was just unfathomable until, say, you went to college in the Midwest. And so in that way, having contact between people can help these ideas take root that diversity is valuable. And by virtue of meeting people, it gives you a representation of a group that maybe you've only read about in books, maybe you've only heard about on the news. And because you now have a person that you know who's part of that group, it makes you realize that probably what you have known and what you had believed about the group actually isn't that true. So once again, this is the contact theory or contact hypothesis, that when we interact with people who don't look like us, who aren't like us, who are from the out group, so if you're white, anybody who isn't white, this can help break down your prejudices and biases. For the record, I'm not saying because I grew up in a super diverse place that, I don't carry with me implicit biases. As I said, as a psychologist, we have to acknowledge we all carry around with us implicit biases. But with the research based on the contact theory or hypothesis shows, is that the more we come into contact with different people, the better we are at either breaking down those implicit biases and minimizing their impact on our behaviors and how we interact with other people. It's really complicated. Once again, if this is something that interests you, email me, reach out. This is something that I have a lot of articles that I can share on as well. Another thing is accountability. So we have to set up systems that basically force us to come face to face with the extent to which we're implementing what goes on in our diversity and inclusion trainings. So this Harvard Business Review article gives the example of a company that looked at the units. I believe it was the salaries in different units broken down by demographics. And it basically spelled out for them, look, you're paying the women less and the people of color less than you're paying the white men. And by virtue of having that accountability system, it really actually forced people to come to terms with whether they were actually implementing what was going on in the training in the workplace. So these are a few ways. As I said, the HBR review gives a little bit more about how you can make diversity and inclusion trainings a little bit more effective. So I'll just close with this, cultural milieus, so in other words, the cultural context that we live in, they change. And right now there are basically some very loud voices saying that these kinds of trainings are useless and that they are in some ways offensive. And sometimes, even though those voices are loud, and they may give you the infrastructure and the protection to not hold yourself accountable to actually embracing the values of diversity and inclusion, what you sometimes need to hold yourself accountable to instead is to doing what's right instead of what is convenient and makes you comfortable and what is normatively sanctioned. In other words, what everybody else is telling you it's okay to do. So in short, Sometimes it's better to hold yourself accountable to what's morally right, not just what other people are shouting very loudly. So I'll leave you all with that. Like I said, if you have any questions about these things or some of the points that I brought up, or you're confused, I would be happy to clarify. So include it in the chat, in the module, send me an email or whatever you would like. And that's it.